All right, welcome. I'll give a few minutes for everybody to settle in, but just want to start off by welcoming everybody to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. I'm Jane Ballard, and I'm with the Science Collaborative. I'm taking over for our usual host, Nick Soberall. Today's webinar is going to be featuring Lisa Maillard, a PhD candidate from the University of Michigan, whose research focuses on collaborative science. You'll hear from Lisa shortly, but before we get started, I just have a quick introduction on the reserve system, the Science Collaborative, and the webinar series. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a national network of 30 unique research reserves, as shown on the map. This is a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, a university, or a nonprofit at each of the sites. And each reserve site includes programs that are focused on land stewardship, research and scientific monitoring, training programs for the public and local officials, and education. And the Science Collaborative supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers by coordinating regular funding opportunities and supporting user-driven collaborative research and transfer activities that address critical coastal management needs identified by these reserves. And this webinar series features project teams supported by the NERRS Science Collaborative, program staff, and partners. Speakers share their unique approaches to addressing current coastal and estuarine management issues. So if that sounds interesting to you, join us for future webinars to learn about new methods to integrate experts and users into the research process and how the research results and products might inform your work. So just to cover some general housekeeping rules, all attendees have been muted upon entry and will be handling the Q&A via the GoToWebinars questions feature that you should see in a column. You can enter questions for the presenter as they occur to you throughout the webinar, and we'll discuss as many as we can during the final portion of today's webinar. And the chat is only visible to organizers and panelists, and you can use it to alert us of any technical issues. So with that, I'd like to welcome Lisa, and I'll start out by sharing a little bit about Lisa. Lisa Maillard is a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan's School for Environment and Sustainability, studying the processes of engaged research and knowledge creation. Her research for the NERRS Science Collaborative centers on analyzing the institutional dimensions of collaborative science and understanding how these dimensions translate to project impacts and user experience. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Thank you all so much for giving me the chance to talk to you about my work. Today we'll be digging deeper into user engagement and building collaborative science capacity. For reference, and just to sort of make what I do a little bit more tangible, the concepts of engaged research and actionable knowledge creation and collaborative science all center around the idea that bringing researchers and potential knowledge users together to create knowledge will make that knowledge more impactful. And what I do specifically is I kind of look under the hood of these processes to understand under what conditions engagement actually makes a difference. So that's a little bit about me. And specifically for the Science Collaborative, as Jane said, I look at institutional dimensions, but from a more practical standpoint, I look at how the NERRS Science Collaborative's program has evolved over from its inception to current time, and understand how that has made a difference in terms of user experience. So next. The work that I'll be talking about today is related to these concepts, and there's a large field of research around the idea that increased interaction yields more impactful knowledge by providing benefits for both the project teams and intended users. From the user's perspective, they are more likely to feel trusting of knowledge that they have ownership over by being involved in the creation process. And they can also better integrate this knowledge into their decision-making processes from the outset. Meanwhile, project teams are better able to tailor data or products that are informed by practical use. They can build connections that may enable future work, and they're also building new skill sets through this collaboration. However, as I'm sure many people attending this webinar know, these collaborative science processes have high transaction costs for everyone involved. From both a user and a project team standpoint, collaborative research is highly time intensive, and it requires a fundamentally different mindset from more traditional approaches to research. So there's this assumed trade-off, right, between these greater resource requirements and correspondingly greater impacts, but there has not been an overwhelming amount of evidence or research that has been conducted on whether this trade-off is significant and warrants a collaborative approach under most conditions. So the NERRS Science Collaborative, as a funder and supporter of collaborative science, wants to make sure that this form of engagement is worthwhile for all parties and that it is providing the most useful form of support for efficient and impactful engagement. And the research described from here on out is just one part of the Science Collaborative's overall approach to evaluating collaborative science. Next. So it will probably be helpful to provide a little background into the history of the Science Collaborative. The collaborative had previously funded a doctoral student, James Arnott, who did research very similar to what I'll be talking about today, where he looked at the evolution of the Science Collaborative from the first generation to the fourth generation. And when I say generation, James grouped several years worth of the program based on consistent program logic. So we'll see 5 to 7 years where you can see a discernible pattern as to what the Science Collaborative is trying to achieve and how it's trying to achieve that. And that's why we think of them as generations, because they sort of iterate and grow on each other. The first generation of the collaborative was called the Cooperative Institute for Coastal and Estuarine Environmental Technology, which is a mouthful, so I'll be calling it SciCET from here on out. And it was a NOAA program that was run through the University of New Hampshire and started in 1998. So at this point, the earliest generation embraced what we in academia call the loading dock model, which is the idea that as long as research is methodologically sound and it's put in a place where the public can theoretically access it, then potential knowledge users will find a way to get to the research and retrofit it or modify it to suit their needs. And it also leads to potential commercialization. So very similar to the way that we think about most research. The second generation, or tech transfer generation, took a more active approach in terms of ensuring that the science and technology research that project teams were doing eventually led to application. So here there's a little bit more encouragement of handoff of science and technology and some encouragement of more in-depth interaction. But the inclusion of end user input was not systematic. It was really sort of on a project by project basis. And the focus was still around the development of tech from more of an innovation or an academic perspective. In the third generation, or the knowledge systems generation, we start to see a more intentional focus on actively seeking out and integrating intended user feedback in the way that the project develops and that outputs are created. So here, there is more active consultation of intended users, and there's more structured support from SciCET, whether that be in request for proposal materials or just the general program language. The fourth generation is what we consider to be the collaborative science generation, and this is where the program became officially known as the NERRS Science Collaborative. In this generation, collaboration with intended users was not only a requirement, but it actually became a leading principle of the program. So this is sort of the thrust of what the program intends to do. And as such, a project co-lead focusing on collaboration is now required from project teams. Proposals have to identify end users, describe their collaborative approach, and also sort of corroborate the relevance of the project's proposed focus in a more grounded context. The current generation, which we've titled Engagement and Impact, has been more intentional about bridging the gap between collaborative process and knowledge use. So it sees the collaborative approach not as an end within itself, but as a means of enabling impact. And part of this philosophy involves being more intentional about engagement to leverage resources effectively and be mindful of both the project teams and intended users' capacity. One of the engagement and impact generation's main ways of addressing this goal is being a little bit more selective in funding projects that demonstrate a clear consensus between project teams and intended users. Next. So, in addition to categorizing the first 4 generations, the current generation was outside of the scope of work that James produced. But James's research also looked at the ways that several dimensions of the program have evolved over time, from this initial loading dock all the way up to the collaborative science generation. So James qualitatively coded 120 randomly selected project reports, which is 30 reports from each generation, and coded for many different aspects of collaborative science. I've carried 2 such aspects forward to inform the research that I'll be talking about in just a little bit. But in terms of what James found in this initial study, he looked at something that we're calling interaction intensity, which is the extent of interaction between researchers and end users. And this intensity can be thought of as a scale. So bear with me, some of this is going to be a little bit more high concept, but it'll help inform the rest of the webinar. So at the lowest end of this scale, we can see that there is no structured interaction between project teams and end users. The second lowest level of interaction, which James called linking or consulting, can be thought of as the targeted dissemination of knowledge to intended users to inform decision-making and management. So sort of a one-way interaction. Matchmaking, which is one level up, occurs when diverse types of knowledge producers are connected with users to frame research questions and interpret results. So here, a little bit more bidirectional. There's some back and forth going on, but it's still not as deep as it could be. Co-developing, which is the second highest form of interaction intensity, occurs when knowledge users are active throughout the process, including articulation of research questions, design of projects, collection and analysis of data, and production of outputs. So this is, I think, where we're getting closer to this concept of collaboration as we know it. And finally, co-owning is the highest form of interaction that James was looking for. And this is where users are empowered and have the capacity to critically assess and potentially co-lead projects. So I want to acknowledge that these are qualitative codes, meaning we are interpreting, in this case, text to determine where we think different projects fall. And there can be slight variation in how different people are going to interpret a specific code, especially when there's not really any hard or fast rules that we can use. In the case of James's work, most of the research that he did was coded by 2 people, which can help sort of come to a consensus about how these fuzzy concepts can look. But in any case, what we can see from James's research is that there is consistent movement through the generations toward more direct, intense, and bidirectional interaction with users. What he found is that interaction intensity literally grows exponentially between that third knowledge systems generation and the collaborative science generation. It sort of explodes, so to speak, which was a really powerful finding. Next. So another pivotal dimension that James's report coding work analyzed was the dimension of knowledge use. So again, the different categories of knowledge use can be thought of as a scale, although I will argue that it isn't necessarily the best idea to do so a little bit later on. But for now, we'll treat it as a scale. So at the lowest end of the scale is evidence of non-use, obviously, and this generally occurs in the earlier generations that are more tech-focused or methodologically focused, where you can see that Project teams have explicitly stated that the work did not yield what they expected it to, the product never got off the bench, etc. Indeterminate use just means we don't really know. There's no description in the project report as to whether or not this knowledge went anywhere or whether or not intended users have done anything with it. Symbolic use is when intended users use knowledge to sort of validate an existing position or decision. It confirms an existing understanding. It doesn't really move beyond what somebody already thought or knew. Conceptual use occurs when intended users use knowledge to expand their understanding of a particular problem or its potential solutions, so considering dimensions that they hadn't before or thinking about solutions in a different way. And finally, instrumental use is probably what we most commonly think of when we think of how knowledge is used, and this is where you can actively trace a path between knowledge and some form of decision making. So for instance, knowledge created about wetland restoration leads to the creation of a policy that protects a greater area of wetlands, something like that. And what we're seeing here, as with interaction intensity, is that there is significant growth in both conceptual and instrumental use from the first to the fourth generation. So again, we are seeing growth. Next. With that being said, the figure on this slide juxtaposes interaction and use through the first 4 generations of the Science Collaborative. And these dimensions, when collapsed and viewed together, present an interesting finding. Although interaction intensity seems to be following a rough exponential curve from the first to the 4th generation, the growth of use is both lower and slower than that of interaction and follows a more linear path. So what this seems to indicate to us is that although increased collaboration does subsequently increase knowledge use, more is not necessarily more in regards to a collaborative approach. Next. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of what James's research found. There was really a lot of richness to the work, but that gives context for what I have carried forward, and I sort of expanded on some of this work in a few different ways. So firstly, as the Science Collaborative begins to explore potential ripple effects occurring as a result of project work, we have moved beyond the traditional typology of use to incorporate a broader understanding of impact. I do want to note that use is an important consideration. It feels tangible and it's meant to increase decision making, which is very important to the Science Collaborative, so it was worth measuring. But we're starting to understand that there are broader or more diffuse outcomes of the work, which may be just as meaningful to intended users. The second point that I've added onto this research is the practical dimension of the collaborative process. And what I mean by that is looking at what engagement actually looks like beyond this sort of bird's eye view understanding of interaction intensity. What are people doing on the ground? And if there are specific forms of engagement or process activities that are more or less valuable to achieving specific forms of impact. So trying to draw some connections there. Finally, and I think most importantly, given the current generation's program logic and what they're hoping to achieve, this research analyzes the experience of intended users themselves to provide a different perspective than what is documented in project reports. So if the intended goal of the Science Collaborative is indeed to foster impactful knowledge through collaborative science, it is worthwhile to speak to the users for whom the knowledge is being developed and see how they feel about it. Next. So to conduct this research, I adopted a 3-pronged approach that would better allow me to answer my central sort of research interests. First, I expanded upon James's report coding by coding 120 reports across all 5 generations, including the current generation of the NERRS Science Collaborative. This is 24 reports per generation. Secondly, I analyzed the results of a pre and post-project survey, which was distributed to intended users that were identified by project teams in 2017, and again, roughly a year after project completion. So I believe that the pre-survey had about 120 respondents and the post had 80 respondents, which is a nice, robust sample size for us. And then finally, I conducted some interviews with a group of end users from the current generation, so the engagement and impact generation, who had provided descriptive free response answers to the pre and post surveys to better fill in some of the gaps that the survey instrument couldn't adequately address. And I understand that from a methodological standpoint, this might be a little tricky because obviously the people who had the strongest feelings about the collaborative project might have the most to say in a free response question. But it was a means of reaching out, and we actually had great success with interviewing those folks. And then when we tried to reach out to some people who maybe hadn't filled out the free response quite as descriptively, the response rate was not quite as good. So we did try to cast a broader net, but we mostly ended up talking to those people. Next. So across all three forms of data, the project reports, the pre-post surveys, and the interviews, I considered three factors. The first were the goals of the project. These can relate to the creation of tools, development of networks, policy or societal impacts, ecological benefits, that sort of thing. The second was the process. What did the collaborative process look like? This is referring to both interaction intensity writ large and the practicalities of engagement, such as the use of workshops, surveys, interviews, field trips, and so on. And finally, what were the outcomes of the work? How closely did those outcomes actually align with project goals? Did we do what we meant to? Did we go beyond that? Did we fall a little bit short, and why? And maintaining that focus on knowledge use as well. So we're looking at outcomes broadly, but then also doing sort of an analysis on knowledge use, as James has done. Next. So the next section of this presentation will primarily focus on the findings of the project report coding and include some key user quotes from these interviews that were conducted with intended users from the current generation, which sort of expand on the points of discussion. And the quotes, I think, are really helpful in grounding some of the findings of this research. Next. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the collaborative goals that I found across the 5 generations of project reports. So these different categories, unlike the previous figures that we looked at, are not on a scale. They're individual counts, which means that you can obviously have more than one type of goal in a project. So we're starting with goals because I'm going to be going through these different dimensions chronologically, and we're just going to start with what people were hoping to get out of the project. There are a few trends to note in this figure. First is, I think, pretty self-evident from the figure, but there's a somewhat linear increase in collaborative goals. And more importantly, we're seeing an increase in the diversification of said goals as the generations progress. So not only are we aiming a little bit higher, but we're sort of trying to do more things. Second is this relative consistency of products as an intended goal, that it's the bulk of most of the generation's goals. And I think this makes a lot of sense when we think of products as an anchor point for the project. And these can be a means through which to envision and then potentially achieve secondary goals. But it's a great way to have something tangible to hold on to in a project to kind of guide you through it. And third, I think potentially the most interesting is the slight contraction in goals from the 4th to the 5th generation. So the collaborative science to the engagement and impact generation, we're seeing that shrink a little bit. There are 2 potential explanations for this. The first and most obvious from a visual standpoint is that we're seeing a drop-off in goals that focus on ecological impact. And I want to flag that this may just be a result of random report selection. As I said, I coded 24 reports from each generation. That's maybe a third to a quarter of the reports available for each generation. So some of the stuff that might be in there, I just didn't have a chance to code. And I've personally interviewed at least intended users from at least 2 projects of the engagement and impact generation that did deal directly with ecological restoration. So that's one explanation. The other, which is also likely given the rest of the analysis that I'll be presenting today, is that the engagement and impact generation is more intentional in its scoping of funded projects, and this may encourage project teams to be a little bit more reflective on what they think they can achieve at the outset, given their engagement approach and what the resources that they have. So that is another possibility. And then another minor trend that's worth noting is the growth of specific codes between the collaborative science and the engagement and impact generations. So most notably is the growth of network development goals and the inclusion of goals that seek to catalyze future work. And I think these both help to boost the self-propagation of collaborative science impacts. I've included a quote on the left-hand side, and you'll see some of these throughout the rest of the presentation, but this really speaks to the importance of adequate project scoping and the importance of leveraging experience from previous projects to inform the way that this one is designed to help avoid redundancies or repeated mistakes. So, it is a critical part of project development. It's just thinking about what we can achieve and why it matters. Next. So this is going to look kind of familiar. I also looked at interaction intensity like James. And what we're seeing is, a sustained growth of interaction from the loading dock to the engagement and impact generation. However, similar to the collaborative goals dimension, we do see a notable contraction in interaction intensity between the 4th and the 5th generations. And again, this is most likely due to the current generation scoping approach. I have had the opportunity to interview the intended users of the engagement and impact generation projects across a range of grant types. And they tend to say anecdotally that parsimony is key when it comes to impactful collaboration. And, everybody has a different bandwidth, and not everybody will want to take part in every meeting, workshop, field trip, etc. And so there is a little bit of nuance in that respect. But no matter the focus area of the project, the quote on this slide also serves as an important reminder that project teams should always aim for efficiency with their engagement approach. The work matters, it is very important, but it's one of many things that matters most of the time. And project teams should ask themselves what they are aiming to accomplish with each instance of interaction or engagement. Next. So bird's eye view, we can see that interaction intensity grows and then sort of plateaus as we get to the current generation. I was also, as I mentioned, interested in looking at what engagement actually looks like on the ground across the generations. And so I made an effort to look at specific process activities. Early process activities, as we're seeing here, were few and far between and seemed to lag even until the transition between the knowledge systems and the collaborative science generation. And this dramatic jump in process activities sort of mirrors James's earlier finding that the growth of interaction intensity between those generations increased exponentially. So we're seeing that corroborated with a different form of analysis entirely. It checks out. And again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we are seeing a clear contraction in process activities between the collaborative science and the engagement and impact generations, with a decrease of around 23% from an account perspective. However, the diversity of approaches remains the same. So here the quotes are a little bit different. They don't seem to relate quite as directly to the graphic, but they speak to the point that was repeatedly made when interviewing intended users, which is that a process activity is extremely valuable when the focus is on the outcome. So for example, the top quote points out that encouraging dialogue is only possible if the right channels of communication are open. It's not enough to simply put different stakeholders in the same room or encourage them to be on the same phone call. One has to acknowledge who will be willing to speak to whom and devise workarounds as needed. So being a little bit more intentional when we think about that interaction. And the bottom quote focuses on the importance of meaning, not just the structure of an activity. In this particular community, the intended user that I spoke to said that it was critical that project materials be written in an accessible and non-jargony language, which I think is a good rule of thumb, but was particularly heightened in the context of this project. So it made a big difference in terms of how the findings were communicated, not just that they were communicated. Next. So we've spoken a little bit about goals, interaction intensity, and process activities. And projects might be wondering if there is a way to synergize these different components or think about them while they're planning their projects to achieve the most impact. And I will say that there are no hard and fast rules about which process activities are most critical to which types of projects. We don't want to make any blanket or prescriptive statements because so much of this work is contextual, but we do observe general trends that might prove useful, or at the very least, a framing that might be helpful to project teams that they can use. It's a visioning exercise, if you will, that they can use on their own to try and figure out what they should be doing. So it is true that certain types of collaborative work require a more intense approach and may benefit from corresponding process activities. This tends to be the case when the project goals are centered around public policy or societal impact, or when these projects involve contentious or value-based decision-making. And in these cases, the establishment and maintenance of trust is critical, right? So here, we may encourage greater use of face-to-face interactions such as meetings or workshops to, number one, allow different stakeholder groups to weigh in and feel heard. And number two, hopefully work toward a shared understanding of the problem and consensus around solutions. We may encourage moderate interaction when projects are trying to reconcile different research approaches to increase usability or test a methodology across a network of geographic contexts. In this case, moderate interaction is needed in order to allow for methodological course correction. So, we're noticing that this approach it works in this setting, but maybe not so much in this setting, and we have to address that. But you also want to give the tools and the tech and the methodologies time to breathe, right? Where meeting several times a week probably is not the most efficient use of one's time. But in this case, field trips can be useful in this sort of work to allow researchers to get a sense of what will and won't be possible on the ground at different locations, right? Just to see where the tech can and can't be used and those other considerations. Finally, some projects, such as the development of tech products or data acquisition with intended users, don't necessarily benefit from extensive interaction. In this case, it can be enough to set expectations early on about what can and cannot be accomplished, right? So, say straight away, here's what we think we can do, and this falls outside of our scope, and then provide a few key opportunities for feedback or beta testing before unveiling the final product. But as I've said, these decisions are entirely contextual. We're going to do a little bit of a switching of pathways here. For example, in projects with policy or social goals that have place-based values embedded within them, then field trips might be beneficial to get people with differing understandings or opinions on the project in the same spot so that they can talk about their values, etc., on the land in question. In network-based projects where one team member or subgroup is leading the charge, others might want to weigh in with feedback where appropriate and then defer to the project leads the rest of the time. So again, not everybody has to be as involved at every step of the project. And finally, in projects that are developing products or tech and seek to not only distribute this technology to end users, but also ensure that it works the way that it's meant to, then you might want to use workshops to walk users through the product and sort of see how they feel about it. So as I said, this sort of visioning exercise can help project teams intentionally trace a path from their goals through the appropriate level of interaction and to potential engagement activities. And I think that the results are helping the Science Collaborative enhance its support materials and potentially reframe the conversation around the connection between goals, engagement, and impact to sort of tighten those links even further. Next. So now that we've discussed goals, interaction, and processes, we can take a look at outcomes of these projects. So I think this is a pretty exciting comparison. The figures here show overwhelmingly positive results, with the slight caveat that the first 2 generations yielded slightly lower outcomes than goals. But again, this is to be expected when we consider that the first 2 generations were focused on the development of tech or of research, and when that was not successful, they were proverbially dead on arrival. It was a little bit harder to find outcomes of the work. However, following the second generation, the remaining generations have all exceeded their initial goals. And in the collaborative science and engagement and impact generations, this is particularly impressive. And we see a greater expansion of outcomes in some of these categories that I've already mentioned are great for self-propagation, right? So network development, catalyzing future work, and public impact, things that will maybe carry this work beyond the initial scope. So interestingly, next. I once again sort of took these trends, collapsed them, and put them into a different sort of visual format. And what we're seeing here is that it also appears that the 5th generation, the engagement and impact generation, is yielding approximately the same amount of outcomes with comparatively fewer process activities, which indicates sort of this reduction of transaction costs that are necessary to achieve significant impact. I want to be clear in the fact that a lot is owed to the collaborative science generation, which fully catalyzed the adoption of the collaborative approach and has allowed the 5th generation to hone in on its own approach and more efficiently support project aspirations. But I mean, they really, we can see the impact that they've had moving forward. And a greater analysis of the patterns that I previously mentioned, so what levels of interaction matter when, what process activity details should be considered for what sort of work, etc., may eventually allow these points to converge. That's the ultimate goal. Next. So finally, we revisit the concept of use. Here we can see growth across all 5 generations, and this pattern sort of continues all the way up to the current generation. Although we only see a few instances of instrumental use in the first 2 generations, by the engagement and impact generation, all 3 forms of use are present, and we no longer see any instances of indeterminate or non-use. And I want to point out that the fact that conceptual use remains greater than instrumental use is not necessarily a bad thing. There has been research done that conceptual knowledge can potentially be the most impactful over the long term for project teams. This is because mindset shifts tend to persist as individuals pursue new projects or encounter new problems, while incorporating knowledge into a policy document or a protocol can lead to the decision-making equivalent of set it and forget it. So, you know, the conceptual use might carry on beyond whatever document is written up or protocol is put into place. And as I previously mentioned, these types of use can also build on each other. They're not mutually exclusive. The quote on the left is a small fragment of a conversation that I had with an intended user who gave a great example of how different forms of use may intertwine. In their anecdote, this conservation district manager explained that a resident had received federal compensation to put in a wildlife pond by removing habitat that the collaborative research project was demonstrating had critical value for fish and streams. And a different community member that had been educated through involvement with the project was able to contact the agency responsible for the compensating program and led to the discontinuation of this program, which is kind of crazy to think about. So here what we're seeing is that the community members' enhanced understanding of habitat importance to fish populations, which we can think of as conceptual knowledge use, led to the discontinuation of a harmful agency program, which we can think of as instrumental knowledge use. So again, these things feed into each other, and they're very powerful in that respect. Next. So as I'm sure some people in the audience are thinking about right now, part of the difficulty in evaluating the trends we just explored is knowing whether the trends are indeed dictated by changes in project approach or whether they may indicate a response to program language. So what I mean by that is that project teams are obviously transparent in their reportings, and they do a really good job of writing thorough reports of how a project occurred. And this is true even when the projects don't necessarily meet all intended goals that they put forth in their proposals, but they may still be influenced by the Science Collaborative's institutional logic at that point in time, and may notice or explicitly mention things in project reports just as a result of this influence, right? So one means of ensuring that the trends we're seeing are actually a result of change in collaborative practice at the project level is to quantitatively measure the impact from the intended user side of the equation. And this allows us to sort of triangulate our results and make sure that what we're seeing is also visible to intended users and is not maybe just because of the way that project teams are now thinking about collaborative work. The following slides review the findings of our post-project survey, which allows us to have this more quantitative element to the work, and are also matched up with relevant interview quotes. It's worth mentioning that the survey covered a lot of ground, including questions on how users felt about engagement, previous collaborative experience, and how they routinely use knowledge in their daily work. But I'm going to be focusing on analyzing a few of the process and outcome survey items that are most relevant to this current work. And we are going to start, as you can see, with a question asking how respondents felt about the level of interaction that they received during the collaborative project. And what we're seeing is that respondents overwhelmingly felt that the amount of time they spent interacting with researchers was appropriate. And roughly 95% of survey respondents said, yeah, this is exactly where it needed to be in terms of how often we met and how, how in-depth our conversations were with project teams. So I think this is a pretty encouraging finding, especially in light of the significant dip in process activities that we noted between the collaborative science and the engagement and impact generations, as well as the overall lowering of interaction intensity. Next. Survey respondents also overwhelmingly felt that their input had been used to inform project activities and outputs. So not only was the interaction level where it should be, but they felt like they had a voice, that their presence mattered and made a difference in terms of the direction that a project went in. Next. So we talked a little bit about process. Now these questions are about use, and speaking almost directly to the point that I just made about triangulation, we can see here that all survey respondents from the current generation have found some use in project impact, indicating that the results from the project report coding showing ubiquitous use in this current generation are not likely to be incidental. They're backed up by the survey responses. And again, there is a possibility that respondents from previous generations would have said the same, but without asking them directly, we have fewer forms of evidence to corroborate this assumption. Next. So here we're unpacking various dimensions of use that our survey explored. This one relates to the idea of conceptual use, and the quote here highlights the importance of the development of ideas, language, and frameworks that can transfer outside of a particular problem context to create broader impacts. I want to be mindful of time, so we might move through the next couple slides a little bit more quickly. So next. This statement has moved from measuring conceptual use to analyzing how this use relates to efficacy. In the literature, efficacy is made up of two components. First, there is the belief in self-efficacy, which is the idea that if I have the power to make a difference or to do something differently. In this case, the action that I'm applying is to take lessons learned from this project and apply them to my job. And then there has to be a belief that when I do something differently, it's going to elicit a different response. So in this case, applying the lessons learned from a project to one's job means that one can now perform that job better. And the reason I go into the nitty-gritty on this is that there's evidence in the literature that perception of self-efficacy is one of the most critical components to fostering long-term behavior change. So the quote on this slide is also kind of interesting because it discusses the potentially controversial idea that failure is just as, if not more, likely to improve one's ability to do one's job. It can often be daunting to report negative results, especially when that reporting may affect a project's chances of being funded again in the future. However, as this interviewee points out, failure is often a means of getting closer to success, and lessons learned matter not only to the project team itself, but also to the funder as an indication of what to flag for future projects interested in doing the same work. So that's important to consider. Next. So the final item pulled from the post survey relates to organizational capacity and conceptual knowledge use. And what we're seeing here is also very encouraging from a ripple effect standpoint, because it shows that project impacts have the potential of rippling out to influence the broader organization that an intended user works for. And that's sort of what the quote here is speaking to. Okay, next. So part of this work is meant to provide useful insights for those seeking to undertake collaborative science projects. And here are a few insights that have popped up across all three forms of data analysis. Some of these might be self-evident to audience members who are more well-versed in collaboration, but may be useful to those newer to the work. First, project scoping should be both narrow and long. And by this, I mean that it should be tightly focused, but consider the lifespan of the project beyond funding. And this, I make this point for a few reasons. In terms of it being narrow, projects that don't do this or that have a slightly more ambitious or wider or fuzzier scope often struggle to keep the work on track because new ideas are proposed or different elements are valued more or less than others, and then you start to potentially invite in, a little bit more confusion as to how to move forward. However, the need for long scoping is just as important, because in speaking with some of these intended users, what we're seeing is that they complete a project and then they tell me that a big barrier that they encountered is that they present the results to a regulator or a policymaker, and that person says, this is great stuff, but we don't have the flexibility, the regulatory flexibility to implement it. And so by considering that at the offset and trying to incorporate those people who are going to be doing the work after the project is done, bringing them on as early as a project can sort of help overcome these potential roadblocks. The other important consideration when considering the goals of a project is the need to have the ability to pivot. So this is especially important where projects are developing new methodologies or new tech, and sometimes those methods and that tech does not work, or we realize that it's just not going to be possible to carry those over the finish line. So in this case, it's incredibly important to have a means of pivoting and finding other uses for the work. In terms of interaction intensity, as may be self-evident, that interaction is not one size fits all. This is true not just across projects, but even within projects. Some people are going to be more or less involved. And in this case, and being mindful of project team capacity, it's advisable to build in as many process redundancies as possible. So communicate things in as many different ways as you can in order for people to choose the level of engagement that they would like. And finally, although we know that project teams can't necessarily control the outcomes of the work, we can set the project up for success more efficiently. So one potential means of doing so is the idea of closing the loop, which means holding a clear wrap-up event so that people are all on the same page by the time a project is done. We also encourage the reporting of failure, right, which can lead to better outcomes for other projects and also can help inform the Science Collaborative's approach. And finally, if the project team has the time, it is always helpful to solicit user feedback at the close of a project, not only for the sake of lessons learned, but also to thank users for their involvement and encourage future collaboration. Okay, almost done. Next. So the high-level takeaways of this work is that the Science Collaborative's understanding of impactful collaborative science is ever changing. With each generation, we are learning to consider new dimensions, from knowledge creation to collaboration to impact evaluation. And there's an inherent feedback loop in the Science Collaborative's design. As project teams are doing work under the Science Collaborative's guidance, they are iteratively feeding lessons learned back into the program. This creates a sort of self-correcting system within the Science Collaborative's supportive framework. And the collaborative is currently working to incorporate end user insights into its approach. Specifically, it is updating its guide to collaborative science using takeaways from end user interviews and developing synthesis materials for project teams and end users that were informed by the pre and post project survey results. These materials are meant to contribute to the broader discussion of collaborative science. And finally, the engagement and impact generation is recentering intended knowledge users as not only participants, but also critical informants of the collaborative process and knowledge impacts. They provide invaluable insight into not only what interaction to undertake, but when to do so and how. And they also provide us with new lenses through which to view impacts, including the overlaps of use and similar intangibles. The biggest takeaway, which you can see across the document coding, the interviews, and the survey results, is that the work that the Science Collaborative, its project teams, and many other funders, researchers, and practitioners are doing matters. So that concludes the presentation, and I'm happy to open it up for questions.
All right, thanks, Lisa. That was very informative. Like Lisa said, we'll now turn it over to you, the attendees. You can use the questions feature to pose questions to Lisa, and then any of the unanswered questions will be added to our post-webinar summary. So we have a first question coming in. While the collaborative goal of products remained consistent, could you discern whether there was any difference in the type of products produced? For example, peer-reviewed publications versus user-friendly fact sheets and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think it sort of mirrored the program logic, and the evolution of that program logic that we saw in the first generation was very much focused on academic outputs, as, you know, including peer-reviewed publications. And then the second and third, we're starting to see a little bit more patents, which was really interesting, or, you know, tech from that perspective. And then the fourth and fifth sort of expands that to include things like policy guidance, or, you know, building public education materials, etc. So I think that there is a lot of room for even more granular analysis of what products technically covers. It's not the best descriptor, specifically for the reasons that this question suggested, but there is evolution even within some of these categories, and products is one of them. So it's a great question.
Great. Well, here's another one. Did you use a specific framework or model for your qualitative data coding?
So yes, most of the codes that I used are informed by the literature. There are, I can put citations in, but there are pre-written typologies of knowledge use, interaction intensity, and even the goals and outcomes have been written about and published. The only exception to that is the process activities. Those I coded in a much more grounded approach kind of way, which just means, you know, you code some reports, you sort of see what categories are popping up, and you adjust as you code more and more. But the rest of them, although the framework in its entirety is not published yet. All of the components have been validated in the literature. Yeah.
Okay. And if there's a few handy, we can also include those in the webinar summary.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next one starts out with a compliment. Great presentation. It is really phenomenal to see systematically how the projects have evolved over time. Then they're wondering if, Lisa, you can weigh in on whether it would be right to paraphrase your slide on insights for practice, that this work shows that we cannot always have one size fits all value judgments on levels of interactions or types of outcomes. So high level interaction is not always better than medium. And sometimes medium is just as appropriate if it's also, the quality of the interaction or the richness. And also similarly, if policy impact is not always better than networking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know it's a little bit of a cop-out to say that everything is contextual and we don't want to be prescriptive in our approach, but I do think that that's the value of collaborative work, is that it highlights the importance of that interaction and the importance of context. And so I think that that paraphrasing is entirely accurate and covers the ground really well. That it comes down to how project teams envision this particular project. And what's really interesting is I spoke to some people who took part in multiple collaborative projects, and even there, like you can see that certain approaches look vastly different from one another, and yet the results are still overwhelmingly positive. And I think that a lot of the project teams are really good at discerning what they should be doing and when to achieve what outcomes. So
yeah, I think as a project officer, we see that a lot.
Yeah.
Somebody also asked just to share the citation for James' earlier work and any
Yes.
publications from this work. So Megan is going to share the link in the chat, and any other relevant links we'll be putting in the webinar summary. So it's not necessarily a question for you, Lisa, but just an FYI for everybody attending. The last question I think we have time for would be, how would you suggest translating your findings into the realm of interagency policy coordination? Can you suggest metrics of impact of such work, like the coordination side of things?
I think that, so one potential means of doing this, and I think there is some promise here. It's something that I wasn't able to do methodologically, but looking at the language used in requests for proposals, RFPs, and then being able to trace how those yield different impacts can create lessons learned at an institutional level. So now we're seeing not just how project teams are going from goals to process to outcomes, but even taking that step back and seeing the influence of institutional dimensions, and measuring those in a way that agency A can say, oh, we've seen real success in this type of project when we support them in this way, and that might be a potential offshoot. I don't know that my current work has had the opportunity to look at interagency collaboration as much, but I do think there's a lot of interesting questions that can be answered there.
Great, thank you. All right, we're pretty much done with time for questions. I just want to take a few minutes to wrap up. We'll be posting the recording on our website and YouTube in a few days, and all of the resources and links that we've mentioned will include in the webinar summary. And there's also going to be an exit survey coming up after the webinar closes. And I just wanted to draw your attention to our next webinar on June 22nd, where we'll be partnering with NERRS Restore Science Program to focus on career pathways to collaborative science success. So thanks, Lisa, for presenting, and all of our attendees for spending your afternoon with us. Thank you.
Yeah,
have a good day.
Thank you so much.